Hello everybody, today I'm going to show you how to take a kick and bass from this to something that sounds a lot more like this. Because when it comes to bassline creation recently, I've been working with wavetable basslines, and I've always said that using wavetable basslines is beneficial because it uses less processing. But then if you look at the chain over here, you can see that there's a massive amount of devices. Of course, a lot of them are collapsed over here, so it looks a little bit less in terms of the chain length. But still, you can see that I'm doing a lot in terms of the processing. And today I specifically want to talk about the final parts of the processing. Because for a lot of my tracks, I'm currently in the stage where I need to start working on the details and like the final sound of the track. All of the ideas are written down, all of the different things that I want in there, all of the different sounds that I want in there are already sitting in there. And I need to do a few final things, mainly working on transitions and that kind of stuff, before I can go into mixing and then finally mastering my track. So this is all of the processing that I'm doing towards the end of my kick and bass creation. Of course, there's going to be more once we go into the mixing phase. So what I'm mainly trying to achieve is not so much having the kick and bass sit well in the mix, but getting the tonality and the sounds that I want. And then in the mixing stage, I'll decide if that sound actually works in the context of the mix. Now, I'm not going to look at the whole processing chain over here. As I said, I mainly want to focus on the stuff that is last. Another thing that I have to say is that I cannot just go through like effect after effect. When it comes to kick and bass creation, nothing happens just like placing one element and then placing the next element and then placing the next element. Having different elements in there, having different processes in there, of course, influences processes that may happen before. They maybe need to be tweaked in some way, and sometimes you just change your mind on a particular type of process. Maybe you replace some of the effects that you're using, and therefore you have to tweak things, or maybe you just don't like the effect that you're getting out of certain plugin, and maybe that sometimes only becomes apparent way later in the chain. At the end of the day, this is a very complex topic, so I cannot just go through it step by step. What I mainly want to focus on doing is give you a few ideas of different processes that you can use and what you can expect from them. Another thing that is of course changing while I'm still working on the details is actually the patch itself. In this particular case, this is still an old remnant before I had the subshifter auto sub control patch. This is the version of that patch without the auto sub control in there, except that I took it upon myself to reintroduce that into this particular patch. You can also see that I have changed the velocity mapping over here to remove a groove that previously existed within the MIDI. Because I program in the groove using velocity, this is something that I'm able to do. And then I've also replaced the waveform that we're using for upper harmonics. Of course, the sub is provided by this oscillator over here. In this particular case, I didn't go through the trouble of actually resampling the envelope over here into this wavetable, meaning that there's still a little bit of phase shift coming from the patch itself, but it's very, very minimal. And what you'll find is that for a lot of the other processes, that is also the case. A lot of these stereo spreads are way too high to cause any significant issues with phase shift. The Shadow Hills compressor over here is just a compressor, and the only thing that is being filtered is the sidechain. Next up, we have some EQs over here for transition. This is more writing stuff here. We have another stereo processor, which is barely in use. I think it's just in use for one particular build-up somewhere, right over here. And then as you can see, we have more transition EQs. We have another stereo spread for the higher frequencies. If you look at the differences between these, you can see that we're basically stereoizing the transients differently from the body of the sound. Now, this is an interesting effect that I recently started to explore, because one of the things that I realized is that the transients of my bassline really were sometimes hit or miss when it comes to the wavetable basses. Like, I feel sometimes my transients are just like piercing and they don't really sound that nice. So I've spent a lot more time trying to optimize like a workflow so that I can specifically tackle those transients. Now we still have one more plugin over here. This is M Equalizer. This is an EQ that is set up before I started working on this particular workflow. So this is just the EQ that I had set up before I went into trying to really get a nice transient out of this bassline. That really started over here. And of course, with that 1M stereo spread that we saw before, that is earlier on in the chain. But the main part of that is this dynamics processor over here, these two EQs, this LFO tool, and then this final EQ over here. So let's quickly turn all of this off. What I'm going to do is I'm quickly going to group all of it so that we can have a quick one button bypass. And then I want to go into size scope. Of course, when you're trying to do these kind of things, it's always nice to have a look at what you're doing. If I zoom in on the transient here, what you'll see is that the transient really isn't that well defined. You can see there's like a little click over here, but it's not really coming in with a lot of high frequencies yet. And overall, it almost sounds like it's a little bit too clicky. It sounds like the high frequencies are a little bit too concentrated just at the starting position right here. Whereas it would maybe be nicer if they're kind of spread out a little bit more so that you get a little bit more of a punchy high frequency effect. Because at the end of the day, one of the things that we're doing with the phase shifting on our basslines is we're creating that kind of delayed low frequency response. That is of course also emulated in my bass patch over here. As you can see, the sub bass kind of comes in late through this volume envelope over here. And you can imagine that this is very, very similar to what the kick drum does, where the high frequencies come in first, then you have the mid-range frequencies and then the low frequencies. Of course, that is one smooth transition, whereas with the bassline that is not the case. But you can still kind of emulate that punchiness in the lower frequencies using the phase shift. But what if we take that philosophy and also use it for a high end to smooth out the transient? Because at the end of the day, this transient over here is just high end. Like this is the highest frequency over here, and that isn't reproduced anywhere else in the bass sound. So what we could do is we could apply the same philosophy directly and only to the transient. And that is what this M multiband dynamics is doing over here. As you can see, we're just filtering out higher frequencies here. Like the sustain part of the bassline is going to be just roughly this area over here. And I don't think that this filter is low enough to actually do any significant phase shift on any of the harmonics that really matter for that low end clarity. And therefore this effect is just going to be applied to the transient. Now, in terms of processing on these individual bands, of course, we're not doing anything. We're just using the filters to introduce a phase shift and then sum the signal back together. So all of the compressors, as you will see, have a ratio of 1/1. And then we have some further EQing over here, in this case, in 2 stages to actually redefine the transient a little bit more. I'm going to turn these off now, as well as this effect over here, so that we can just listen to what M Dynamics MB is doing. As you can see, if we zoom into the transient, you'll find that we get this just kind of oscillating waveform over here. Now, one of the things that tends to happen when you do this is that your bass line gets delayed a little bit. You could see it when it was playing, but you can see that doesn't actually seem to cause a problem in here, in that we're still not bleeding into the next transient or the transient of the kick drum. So now we have this more punchy transient. We actually need to shape it. And in order to do that, we have these 2 EQs over here. And this is giving us a little bit more of a click sound, but we can start to hear some really nasty frequencies. And this is where the second discovery comes in that I've made, which involves this telephoto over here, which is just there to shape the bassline one envelope at the time. Then finally, to get a little bit more clarity out of the very high end of the bass, we have this final EQ over here. And that is how I process this individual bassline. Now, one of the things that you'll notice if you're going to try to implement these tricks yourself is that they're very dependent on the bassline that you're working with. For starters, most people have their own ways of processing their basslines, and most people tend to not use wavetable basslines like I do. So you won't run into the exact same issues that I do. So therefore, it wouldn't really make a lot of sense for me to start showing you exactly which parameters I set where, because at the end of the day, your bassline isn't going to sound like my bassline, and therefore with those settings, you're also not going to get the sound that I'm getting. What I just want to show you is the philosophy behind some of these processes. Take, for example, this telephoto over here. What I was essentially doing was kind of like shaping the amplitude of the sound. In the same way that our kick drum over here has a little transient, then goes down and then goes back up in volume. I'm trying to do the same thing with the bassline over here. If I turn this off, what you'll find is that there's going to be a very strong peak right after the transient, which is going to be roughly over here. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to remove this part over here. Now I could just EQ out the specific part of the transient that is making that, because if we just look at this waveform, what we'll see is that we'll see a sine wave which is slowing down, which would just signify that there would be like one frequency over here. What we really see though is that towards this part over here, we get a few more frequencies and that the waveform no longer resembles a sine wave. So let's say up until like this point over here, this is just one frequency. And this is of course caused by the fact that we essentially have a very strong click that is then being filtered in such a way that it creates this sine wave pattern over here. But that means that for the real start of the transient, you can get away with just simple EQing. And that is what you'll see in all of the high frequency stuff over here and over here and over here, because that is just turning up and down different parts of the sine wave over here. But when we get into multiple frequencies at the time, you sometimes have to treat them differently, because if you want to treat those frequencies, you're going to have an EQ that is also treating these last parts over here, and we purely want to be focused on the transient here. That is why I decided to use this volume envelope with LFO tool, because that allows me to just focus on a particular part of the waveform. Now it's a little bit annoying when you're drawing these in. Of course, one of the things that you can do is you can make it a lot bigger. That makes it easier to see, but also harder to place size scope. And then you can just edit the waveform and get the exact bass that you want to. Of course, as you can hear, you need to be really careful exactly how you use this effect. And in this case, of course, I have stored the exact same curve that I have over here, so that I can paste that back in here. So that is the first baseline that I wanted to show you. Because as I said before, showing you just settings and showing you just individual processes where I vaguely explain what I was doing at the time is probably not too helpful. So I'm going to show you another baseline, and then we'll also do a baseline from scratch, where I actually go through a baseline in a project that is currently in production, and I'm going to try to finish it as if it were in final production stage. That project is still not in final production, but there's like a part of the project where I'm basically happy with the idea, so I can use that as a context. But before we go into that, I want to show you a different project. So moving on with the second project, this is the kick and bass. I would say I'm like 95% happy with it. It may be a little bit too plasticky at this stage. And that is again because in this case, I had to do a whole bunch of different processing. As you can see, the first chain is over here. This is right after the synth. And then it goes into this group over here, where we have another chain. You can see a whole bunch of other things happening over here. And this is originally where it's summed together with the stereo bass, which I've now disabled because it sounds like this. What I'll probably end up doing is using the stereo bass as more like a gritty layer, and therefore move it into the sequences group over here, and then just use it in specific parts of the track that need a little bit of extra stereo with excitement, because in certain parts of the track it is just too obvious that that stereo layer is there. And then also in the group what we have over here is the sliding bassline that sits earlier in the track over here. That is also going through this second phase of processing. But today we're just going to stay focused on the rolling bassline. So let's zoom back into here. And what we'll find is, again, in terms of the patch, it is a wavetable bass. In this case, you see we do have the auto sub control. So this time the sub control did came with the preset. And then you'll see a very similar setup as the last bass, in that we have again replaced the waveform over here. And we're also using the velocity. As you can see, we've again done something that basically eliminates part of the groove. These two velocities over here used to be different. And I've just mapped them to the same velocity so that the groove between the last two bass notes of the beat is gone. And then also over here we have an octave jump, which is responsible for a slight level balance over here. There's particular parts of this track where I'm playing a melody with higher octaves that sound a little bit louder. So I just wanted to put those back into place where they need to be. Then we have our standard stuff. We have our EQing, the stereo generation, transgressor over here. And this is where we get into the part where I would say is really the detail processing that we're talking about in this video. By the way, this is a plugin that I haven't shown in the other bass because I didn't use it in there. So quickly, I'll go through transgressor first. This is just an EQ that allows you to equalize the transients differently from the sustain. It is very powerful at what it does, but it's not powerful enough for the really precise detail stuff. At least I would say it's not easy to do the details in this particular plugin. I think it will be possible if you try really hard and you get really finicky with it, but there's much more easier ways to achieve certain effects. So let's dive into this audio effect track over here. This is doing a whole bunch of different things. The main thing that we're doing is we're splitting up the bassline in just the sub and transient over here. And then we have the mid-range of the bassline over here. The way that we're doing that is we have two linear phase multiband plugins. As you can see, analog linear phase here. And you can see that in this case, the two mid bands are muted over here. And then in this other case, we have the exact same setup, but with the different bands muted. Now for the sub and the transient, we're not doing anything with the processing. This was just so that we could isolate the mid-range. And in the mid-range, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to remove some of the pluckiness of the mid-range. You can hear that we get almost a growly sound if we turn the LFO off. And then if we turn it on, the mid-range gets a lot more impact. Then of course we need a little bit of EQing to control for that effect. And then finally it's summed back together with the sub bass and the transient. And if you unmute and mute this, you'll hear the real difference. It just makes the bassline sound a whole lot more impactful. And the way that this works, the way that I kind of came up with this effect is I had to go back actually into the bass patch itself to actually turn up where this filter is playing. So initially the envelope that I had set up was much darker and I still wanted to have like a strong knocky mid-range to the bassline, but I couldn't get that effect without also getting that growliness that we don't really like, the one that we heard when we turned off the effect. So initially what I had to do when I was setting up this effect is I had to introduce more growliness by opening up this envelope a little bit more, making it less dark. And then we again control that mid-range with the LFO tool over here, which is where the actual effect is then taking shape. Meaning that this kind of trick only really works on the bassline that is a little bit too growly for the effect that you're going for, and then you control it again, as opposed to being able to just be applied to any type of bassline. Like I said before, a lot of these videos when it comes to very detailed bass stuff is really hard to do because it is so dependent on the details of the bassline itself. But then we move to the final plugin in the chain, which actually has a very important function. This is here because Ableton sucks at delay compensation, and when I delete this, another effect later on in the chain gets screwed up. So I was actually going to use this M transient MB for something actually related to processing the bassline. But in this case, it is just there to delay the bassline a little bit so that the delay plugin compensation doesn't actually mess up in any way. Anyway, that moves us on to this chain over here. And this is where we again see a lot of the transitional stuff, a lot of the basic processing over here, some stereo spread, a little bit of saturation. This is also part of the initial way that I set up the bassline actually. So I didn't actually change this when I was working on the details. This was already there, as well as this EQ and of course the transitions that I write in with my filtering, which is what this rack is doing over here. It is really the second part of this chain where all of the interesting stuff happens. As you can see, we have another M Dynamics MB, and as you can guess, this is responsible for the transient, but we're actually using this effect twice. As you can see, we have two different effects set up, and we're also using not the processing, but mainly the volume sliders over here. I don't think any of the processing is actually enabled on any of these. Let me quickly check, but it doesn't seem to be the case here. And in this case, that is also not the case. But you'll see that this allows me to kind of rebalance the transient of the bassline in terms of tonality. And again, the whole idea is exactly what we saw before. It is kind of smoothing out the transient and giving it a nicer click. Then next up, we have a little bit of EQ over here, and then we have this LFO tool over here. This is again doing some kind of shaping, as you can see. Again, so that you can hear the difference in tonality, this is what we get if we turn it off. Let me just quickly move this up a little bit so that you can see as well. Now, of course, this is going to sound really unnatural if you turn this effect off. Again, this has to do with the fact that all of these effects weren't dialed in linearly, and there's still stuff after it, even if it were dialed in linearly. So a lot of this EQing came into play when I finished with this effect over here, and then I also had gone back into this effect over here and changed some of these things. And then most likely I even went back into this chain, and in fact I know that I did because this M transient MB is here to sync it up with this LFO tool over here. This is the LFO tool that is actually causing issues if I delete that M transient MB and that it's no longer synced up. Well, actually, if you look at it, technically it's Ableton's fault, which has the plugin delay compensation that is based on live performance as opposed to like studio work, which is why sometimes your LFO tool goes out of sync. The final two effects are just a little bit of saturation here, mainly for the soft clipping so that I don't go over 0 dB. And then I have a final EQ over here that is just removing like a little bit of one frequency over here. And that is how I ended up with the final tonality of the bassline. One final thing that I now realize that I haven't shown is actually the bassline without any of the effects. So let's set these off over here up until the M Dynamics. And then in this group over here, we'll also turn off this audio effect here. And this is what the bassline sounded like when I started this process of working on the details. There is a little bit of a catch in there in that I probably went back into changing some of the parameters in here as well. I feel like the transient is very, very aggressive now, and I doubt that I would have made a bassline that had this kind of aggressive transient. Now I'll quickly run through it again and turn on the effects one by one so that you just get an idea of what every effect is doing. Again, this isn't dialed in this way, this is just going to be linearly turning on all of the effects. So you can probably hear from that example that throughout the effects, it's not like we're strafing towards a final bass sound. It really just appears when all of the effects are turned on. So what I want to show you now is I want to show you this process from start to finish so that I can run you through some of my decisions. So this is the project that we're going to look at now. This is the context that is currently finished. So I'm going to play this part over here. And honestly, the kick and bass is sounding a little bit better than I expected. This is one of those projects that I've left alone for a couple of months and that I now want to start working on again. And as I said, normally the process that we're going to see now, I do that at the end of the production process when I'm working on all of the details, when I know the context of the full track. But for now, we're just going to work with this little part over here. And I do like doing these kind of design things with just listening to the kick and the bass itself. Even though I think having the context is important, I also think that having the clarity to listen to just the two elements and not have any distractions with any of the other elements helps as well. And of course, I'm also a big fan of using size scope in order to get the bassline that I really like. And again, we're mainly going to look at the bassline here. I'm currently not going to talk about any of the kick related things. So let's make sure that size scope is listening here. One of the things that I would like is a little bit less of a plasticky transient. And I would also like the sub bass to come in a little bit earlier in this bass here. So we're just going to move that slightly before. Something like this. In this case, again, you can see that this is a wavetable bass that we've already worked on. You can see that I've changed out the wavetable over here. You can again see velocity and note control over here. In this case, we are still keeping the groove that was originally set up in the MIDI. And again, we have this volume over here compensating for the octave that is being played. Now, one of the things that I could do is I could fix any of the issues in the transient right here. So for example, I could go down and then back up again to purely target this part over here. But I found that it's a good idea to kind of smooth out the transient first and only then tackle these kind of issues. So that's what we're going to do over here. Let me just quickly close out of some of the processing that we have. Again, there's a whole bunch of different processes and a whole bunch of different transition material over here that was used in the writing part of this track. But we are now going to focus on creating the detail part of the track. And the very first thing that I want to do is I want to try again to use that transient MB trick. So I need to go into dynamics actually. So I'm going to set this to 5 bands over here just to try it out. And I'll, of course, open up size scope again, because I want that down below here so that I can always look at what I'm doing. We can now see that with this filter over here, we're creating a sort of phase shift that is actually basically bleeding into the next transient. That is not what we want. We're going to set these bands already a lot higher here. And now you can see that we get a much cleaner result here. Again, one of the things that I've done is I've shifted it a little bit more towards the high energy over here, almost up until 10K. I think that is getting maybe a little bit too bright, but I want to try out smoothing that area a little bit more first. So we're going to do a second stage of this trick here. And I'm just going to focus a lot of the bands on just that high area of the frequency spectrum, like very, very closely together so that we get nice smoothing. Something very close like this. Okay, I like the sound of that. What I do want to do is I want to low pass it a little bit more. So I'm going to use EQ8 for that. And this really puts the bass into a proper shape in my opinion. Another thing that we can do is use the LFO tool trick. So we're going to go to modulation LFO tool here. And I mainly want to again get rid of this spike over here. Right after the transient, that is an area that I don't really like. Let's also see what happens if we mess with the phase a little bit. I have too many windows open, so let's just remove this for now. I feel like the shape over here isn't exactly what I'm going for. I however don't like how the bass sounds when we have this tonality over here. Like specifically the second harmonic here, I think is a little bit too loud. So I think I'll have to keep it like this. Something like that maybe. One of the issues that we have when it comes to this kind of bass design is because we're not resampling, because we keep everything in MIDI because of our wavetable bass properties, there's a few problems that you just cannot get rid of, stuff like this over here. I can try to tackle this with LFO tool, but it's going to sound very wonky if I try to catch each individual peak over here. So what I'll finally do is a little bit more EQing on the transient, and I think that after that the bassline is pretty much done. Maybe the final thing that we can try is a little bit of stereo widening on the bass, like we saw in the first bass line, where we have separate stereo widening for the high frequencies using M stereo spread. So let's go maybe up to 4K here. Just a nice slight smoothing effect. Of course, we already have the stereo effect from the lower frequencies. from an earlier amp stereo spread, somewhere in this part of the chain over here. And that is technically also doing the higher frequencies already. But at this stage, it would be a really bad idea to start tweaking these parameters, because of course that is going to have an influence on everything that we're doing after that in the chain. And I would need to restore the chain so that it would actually work with the new settings that I set up over here. So for now, I think I'm going to end it over here. This process is often also a long process. When it comes to these kind of things, I like to do it in multiple stages throughout the day. I start working on it a little bit in the morning, and then I take a break for lunch, and then I come back in the afternoon, and then maybe even up until the next day. Because at the end of the day, for these kind of detailed things, you need to spend a lot of time actually trying to figure out what you want. And right now, I'm very happy with the sound of this bassline, but maybe in a few weeks even, this could change. And of course, when I actually get to finalizing the production, I'll also have more context for that. Again, finally, to just give you an idea of what we're actually changing, I'm going to group all of this together. Overall, I would say we're giving the bassline a lot more focus and a lot clearer of a transient. So that is something that I like. One of the things that I'll have to decide is if I like it in the context of the track. Well, for now, I think I like the sound of that. Maybe it's a little bit too much on the bright side, but I'll figure that out later when I have the rest of the context of the track. For now, I hope that you enjoyed something and that you picked up some of my interesting tricks. If you did and you want to show your appreciation, make sure that you leave a like down below. Also, if you have other tricks or other things to say, make sure that you leave a comment. Another way to support the channel is by watching some more of my content. So there will be 2 videos up on the screen right now for you to choose from. So just pick one and enjoy, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.